So, yes, welcome everyone. We're here today talking with Andy about this really fantastic book, The Searchers. Hopefully you've read it. If you haven't still, it'll be a really interesting conversation, some really good topics coming out of the book, and hopefully we'll cover that in the conversation. And of course, as Florence said, there'll be lots of opportunity for you to join that conversation at the end also. So, we'll get started. So, I guess to start off with, really, Andy, the first question was about the title of the book. So, The Searchers. What was the gene of that sort of initially? Thank you.
Sorry, is the volume all right? I've got quite a loud voice. I don't want to deafen everyone. The idea, the title of the book is. There's a little joke embedded in it, which is there's a John Wayne film called The Searchers, and John Wayne, as some people will know, was an incredibly right-wing actor, so I thought it would be quite funny to write a book about lefties invoking his film. But also, more seriously, the idea of the book is the five people in the book, Diane Abbott, Ken Livingstone, Jeremy Corbyn, Tony Benn and Ken Livingstone, they're all left-wingers. And they're all kind of looking for something. They're all trying to create a sort of modern version of socialism, I suppose. And although the book is sympathetic, it's also at various points raising the question, are they deluded? Did they ever find what they were looking for? Is there still something further beyond what they were doing that people have to find? So it's to give an idea that these people didn't have all the answers. And at times, they themselves were thinking, are we ever going to achieve what we want? And I'm interested in how they managed to keep going for all that time. Because if you're political for a long time, just managing to stick with it is incredibly difficult psychologically, I think. So I guess that's the long answer as to why it's called The Searchers.
And obviously, the five people in the book have very different journeys into politics in a lot of ways. And you've written books about the left before, you've written political books. Why did you feel that you wanted to concentrate on these five now? Why did you feel that their story was for now?
The idea for the book sort of came around when Corbyn was Labour leader. And when he was first elected Labour leader, I thought he's a good man, but this isn't really going anywhere. This isn't necessarily significant. And then after about a year and a bit, I thought, actually, he's kind of onto something here. The support he had amongst young people, obviously the enormous increase in Labour's vote in 2017. So first of all, I thought there's a big thing going on here that Corbyn's on top of, but I don't want to write a kind of instant book about that because lots of other people are doing that and they'll do a perfectly good job. What can I bring to the party? And I've written previous books about Britain in the 70s and in the 80s and sort of looking back a bit further. So I knew about Ken Livingstone and the GLC, and I knew about Tony Benn. I knew bits and pieces of this story. And I realised that a lot of it kind of connects together, that Benn, who was the oldest, is the sort of like, if you like, the kind of daddy of the family of lefties. And Corbyn was a protege of his. Livingstone was kind of a protege, but also a rival to Benn. Obviously, Corbyn and Diane Abbott were close, and then Corbyn and McDonnell were close. So I thought there's a way, if you tell these people's stories, sort of warts and all, it gives you a sort of picture of like what's happened to the left in Britain, really from the 60s up to now. And if you do it through five people, it kind of makes it probably an easier read, and also it's true that they were all interconnected. They're all kind of plotting together, falling out, then getting back together. So it's a really interesting group, and they're kind of like, almost like a group of heretics. They're like people who have rebellious beliefs that at various points they think we're going to have a huge breakthrough and nirvana will arrive, and there are other points where there's these five people and there's about 20 other people that care about them and everyone else is ignoring them. And I was fascinated by that they're sort of at times obscure and at other points they're on the news every night. And again, how did they deal with that psychologically, that really strange change of status that happened in their lives at different points in their lives?
You clearly spent time with all of the subjects, and I think you get a sense when reading the book that they were very engaged with the process and they wanted to share their experience. Was there anything sort of that you found that was unexpected or surprised you from that time spent with them?
One thing I found really interesting was that with Corbyn, if you sort of spend time with him and he's relaxed, he's very funny. And when I'd seen him in public, I thought, he's a good man, but maybe he's a bit puritanical and he's sort of very serious and earnest. And he's actually quite funny, and he's very mocking of his opponents. And we were talking about something about the Daily Mail, and he was very, very caustic about the Daily Mail and how absurd it is and how it paints everyone as a cartoon that it doesn't like. And it made me realise that if you're like him and you're a rebel, one way that you stay sane is by thinking that your opponents are on one level a bit ridiculous. That's a way of, and he's right, because in a way, people on the right have a kind of caricature picture of people on the left. But it was really interesting to see that from him. Like, he just had a real twinkle and was quite cheeky about his opponents.
It's a shame we didn't see possibly more of that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and sometimes if you see him speak in a small group where he feels he's amongst friends, again, he'll show that side. Whereas, he's on the Today programme or whatever and they're being very aggressive. He shuts down.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, one of the subjects that Tony Benn was sort of writing, who's already passed. I was quite interested in his, I guess he almost led the way, and a lot of the politics that you talk about for the other subjects, John McDonnell, Ken Livingstone, is a lot of legacy of Tony Benn, but he was radicalised through being a politician. I wonder if you could just talk a bit about that, because he's sort of quite centrist until he actually became a politician, and that sort of...
No, it's a really interesting question. I mean, for those that don't know, Tony Benn, first became an MP in the 40s, and for the first 20 years, he was very successful. He's a sort of young Labour minister. He was very good on TV. So he's almost like a kind of Tony Blair figure, like quite slick, really good communicator, came from quite a wealthy family. And then in the late 60s, he kind of radicalised, and because he'd been a minister for a bit, and he realised that what he was doing hadn't really worked. And he tried to reform bits of British industry, and it hadn't really happened. And he went to an alternative university in Bristol, which the students had set up in 1968 as a kind of radical experiment. And there were all these classes about like race and gender and sexuality, and he went along and he writes about it in his diary, and it was like a massive moment for him, because he was like, oh, I thought politics was just about being a kind of, competent centrist, and actually there's this whole other area which I haven't even thought about at all. And from that moment on in 68, he kind of radicalised. And I think one of the reasons why Benn was so hated by a lot of people in the establishment was because they thought, hang on, you're meant to be one of us. You're meant to be kind of sensible centre-left guy. And then here you are in your 40s, suddenly spending all this time with all these kind of hippies and black activists and talking about not a revolution, but a much bigger change in Britain. And so Benn, his sort of journey in that moment, I think, is really, really interesting. Whereas the other people in the book, in 68, at that point in the 60s, they're all much younger. So for them, they were radicalised by it as well, but they were kind of students or just out of university, so they came to it differently. Whereas Benn had 20 years of being, quite orthodox, quite successful. And then, he paid a big price for that, because he could never be a kind of big minister again. He suffered a lot of death threats. Benn, obviously, we remember in his later years, a sort of cuddly figure, but for a lot of my sort of young, my younger years and my adolescence, Benn was a kind of hate figure for people on the right. Wedgie Benn, he renounced his peerage, he's a traitor. There was that feeling around him. And that's because he started out inside the establishment and then he kind of stepped outside it, and they did not like that.
And it was almost, I guess, more offensive to them in a way that he didn't start outside the establishment. He sort of came in and then broke the walls and tried to change the walls.
I mean, I think it's interesting, the 5 people I've written about, I think the 2 of them who maybe were not hated as much, John McDonnell and Ken Livingstone, and I think one of the reasons for that is because they both came from working class backgrounds, and so some people were like, oh, you're allowed to be a lefty because you're working class. Whereas Corbyn was from a middle class background like Benn, and Diane Abbott, being a woman and being black, suffered, continues to suffer all kinds of vile abuse. So it's interesting, partly what the book is about is these people were presenting these radical ideas. What was it that made other people so angry with them? Like, why were people so furious? Because these 5, they're all radical, but they're Democrats. They want to be elected. They're in favour of civil liberties. They're not, in a big scale, sort of dangerous people. And yet, at various points, people felt they must be destroyed because they're too dangerous. And so what does that tell us about what's allowed and what's not allowed within kind of British democracy? So the book is kind of partly about that. Why did they wind people up so much? And I think, we still see that now, that, Diane Abbott even now is a figure of absolute hatred for a certain kind of person. And you just think, she's a long-serving MP, she's quite a sort of tough character, but, really, their hatred seems wildly out of proportion with anything she's ever done.
And it's interesting because we talk about, the radicalisation and these radical people, but actually when you unpack what they stand for and what that movement stands for, is it it really radical? We're talking about equality, fairness, kindness. Should we think that's radical? Should that not just be the norm? And how do you think that's sort of become such a radical or not become, it probably always has been, but is such a radical position?
I mean, I suppose I would say that I've touched on this. I've written about Britain in the sort of Thatcher era in the 70s, and I think since the 1970s, I think Britain has become a very unequal country. And so a lot of people have got a lot invested in the country remaining that way, literally got a lot invested in it. And so if you come along like Corbyn did when he was Labour leader and say, I'm going to make the country a bit more equal, that's seen as very threatening. I mean, even now we're seeing it with, Keir Starmer's quite cautious budget. People are absolutely furious. How dare you make me pay an inheritance tax if I'm a rich farmer? There's people who are very affronted. And although, there's lots of things about Britain that I really like, but as wealthy democracies go, it's quite an outlier. It's pretty unequal, and it's very dominated by London, and the regions are very disparate. So I guess all the people I've written about, they were to some extent saying we're going to change this. And I think particularly Benn, one of the reasons why he was a threat was Benn was very articulate, and if any of you heard him speak, he was a wonderful speaker, and he would make quite radical arguments in kind of everyday language. So it didn't sound like a boring old kind of trot banging on. It would be like a lovely lyrical speech. And again, for the sort of establishment, that was very threatening because you're using almost the language of the establishment to critique the establishment, and people did not like that. And even Benn, at the very end of his life, there's this very moving footage on YouTube of him speaking in Trafalgar Square, literally a few weeks before he died, when there'd been an attempt to force a vote in Parliament about bombing Syria, and it had been defeated. And Benn spoke with other kind of peace campaigners, and he sort of stands there by Nelson's column, and he can barely stand up. He's so frail. He's well into his 80s, and you watch it thinking he's not even going to be able to say anything. And then he makes an absolutely pitch perfect speech for like 3 or 4 minutes. I mean, like you could have written it down, like every clause, every comma just perfectly set, and then sits down and sort of takes a deep breath. And so even right at the end of his life, he could do that, make a case very powerfully. And yeah, that was something that was very threatening for people. They want left-wing people to just be bureaucratic, uncharismatic.
Easy to caricature.
Exactly,
yeah.
easy to caricature. And I think Benn didn't fit the stereotype. Livingstone in a very different way, very cheeky, working-class South Londoner. So you can't say, oh, you're just a privileged lefty, because he'd be like, oh, actually, my dad was a Tory. So he could disarm people in another way. And Livingstone, again, he had his flaws, but he was quite threatening to a certain kind of person. It's like, how dare you be white, working class in South London, yet be so radical and be in favour of gay rights? That doesn't fit. So they kind of didn't fit the moulds that had been built for them, if you like.
Do you think without Benn and his radicalisation and what he did within the party, do you think we would have had McDonnell, Corbyn, Livingstone in the way that they became sort of that same sort of voice? Do you think we would have had those, or do you think it would have been a different landscape within the party over the longer?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think, obviously, if I'm going to argue that my book is a kind of like worthwhile enterprise, I have to say that Benn is kind of key to all this. But no, I mean, I think he's incredibly important. But as people here will know, there was a kind of bigger radicalisation in Britain going on in the 70s, in the union movement, in the environmental movement, in the feminist movement, and so on. So there was a kind of upsurge of radical thinking in this country generally in the 70s. And if there hadn't been a figure like Benn to kind of pull it together, it still would have been very influential. A lot of people have been involved in activism of various kinds. Their lives were changed by that. So I think, yeah, that would have happened to some extent. But it maybe wouldn't have happened in such a parliamentary way, which has upsides and downsides. And maybe it would have been more spread rather than it being about certain key figures. So it's not, although this book is about 5 people, it's trying to make the argument that politics happens in lots of different places at once. It's not just in Westminster or in, the town halls. It can be just a little local demo. That's political too. And all kinds of people who've never, ever voted Labour have still made massive radical changes in Britain. So although this is about Labour figures, hopefully it looks a bit beyond that.
For sure. One of the things that I find quite interesting comes through quite often in the book, sort of dealing with the individual subjects and some of the changes they made, and also the wider sort of thoughts around, you talk about maybe not having electoral victories, but having victories of thought, having victories of belief that have become normal. So, you know, LGBTQ plus movement, race, climate, things that we have over the decades since become part of our normal, become part of our core values, of victories of the left.
Yeah.
But then the political victories don't follow, and there's this disconnect.
Yeah. It's a really good question. I mean, in my other life, I work at The Guardian, and I've written about sort of Westminster politics for a long time, but I've never been a Westminster correspondent. And one reason I've not done that is because I thought I don't want to just be in that place all the time, because I find it claustrophobic, and also because I've always thought a lot of politics is not just about, you know, elections are really important, but one of the beginnings of this book was thinking, if you look back at what the Greater London Council did in the 80s, if people here don't know, that was the kind of city government of London then. Ken Livingstone ran it for a period, and it did all kinds of pioneering stuff around diversity. And if you look at their publications, which at the time was seen as very controversial, even The Guardian would sort of harumph and say, why have they got all this stuff about gay rights every day? And if you look at the publications from the GLC now, they're like something a primary school would give you to bring home with your kids. A lot of that stuff has become pretty standard thinking. And part of the argument in the book is the left haven't necessarily won lots of general elections, but all kinds of ways in which not everybody in Britain acts, but a lot of people are behaving in a way that these people I've written about pushed for. And so there have been these kind of victories that are kind of all around us. And sometimes people on the left are very gloomy. They're like, oh, we always lose. And you're like, well, actually, you know, just everyday stuff has changed in profound ways. And even people on the right would acknowledge that. The Tories are terrifically proud, aren't they, of the fact that they've got a diverse, you know, front bench, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you know, they would not have been making that argument in the 80s, partly because it would have been all white, but also because they would have been like, you know, can't possibly be proud of having, you know, a leader of African descent, et cetera, et cetera. So, the book is kind of pushing at that question. You know, it's important to win elections. You know, when Labour got crushed in 2019, it was awful. But you know, things that Benn and Corbyn and Livingstone and so on have fought for, those things are all around us. You know, the way that this council operates, I'm sure, you know, it has diversity policies that it would not have had 30 years ago. And so that's stuff that's almost like slightly invisible change. I'm really interested in that. What's the relationship between that and electoral change? You need both, I would argue, but I think a lot of Westminster politicians and journalists like to pretend it's all about Westminster, that's all that matters. And I think particularly with social change, when a social change starts, it's always a small number of people. So in electoral terms, they're always quite weak. You know, if you'd had a referendum about gay marriage in the 80s, you know, it would have been crushed. But by the time the referendum happened, you know, or rather the referendum, by the time legislation happened, essentially there'd been this slow change. And my dad, who was, you know, I was devoted to him, but my dad was a sort of retired soldier, quite small C conservative. I remember my dad saying to me when Labour brought in civil partnerships, oh, it's quite right that gay people should get married, you know, whereas if you'd asked my dad that same question in the 70s, he would have been like, homosexuality is evil, you know. So he, almost without knowing, had sort of gradually shifted.
It's really interesting. It's almost as if as long as you don't badge it as socialism or left, and it just maybe the left, I say we, but you know, those of us on the left are maybe just not good enough at sort of putting our stamp on it and saying this is why we're here, and allowing that door to be opened. So, I mean, using sort of gay marriage as an option in civil partnerships, that's not an extreme position, but we've become labelled as extremists. You know, some of the things, as you said, about some of those people have been written about are really somebody being a danger, you know, Corbyn being a danger to the country. It's just because actually what he believes in is would seem to be quite just not an extreme position.
Yeah, I mean, I think with Corbyn particularly, a lot of people were very anti him because they felt in foreign policy terms he would be too soft. He'd be sort of soft on Putin, or he would be soft on, you know, Iran or whatever. And I think a lot of that was kind of exaggerated. But there was a sense that, you know, he's not going to stand up for the country, and that's going to make us unsafe. But without wanting to get into a big debate about the Ukraine war, you know, I don't think us arming Ukraine and, you know, escalating that war is necessarily making us safer now. So the Corbyn approach to Ukraine might have been different and would have had risks, but the current approach also has risks, you know. And again, I think a lot of what the book is trying to push against is these people I've written about, they're always seen as a risk. You know, I remember in 2019, it was like, if Corbyn becomes Prime Minister, it's such a risk. You know, he's a radical left-wing person, the country will be in turmoil. Well, we got Boris Johnson. That was quite a big risk, you know. And it frustrates me sometimes that some of the people, including Corbyn in the book, wouldn't almost be aggressive enough to sort of say in debates and so on with people like Boris Johnson, you're calling me someone who's too pro-Putin. Actually, Russian oligarchs have funded your party. You know, so there's a sense in which the left are seen as the risky choice, whereas I would argue that often the right are the risky choice. You know, Brexit, which, I mean, personally, I didn't support it, but even for supporters, it was an incredibly risky thing to do. Oh, we'll leave this trading bloc, you know. And a lot of things Thatcher did were incredibly risky, and I would say wrong, but they were huge risks. And yet it's the left that are seen as the risky. And a lot of people in the centre, especially, you know, people who write in the FT, those sort of places, they're sort of intelligent people. They think, oh, we're quite worldly. And I remember the FT were like, oh, well, we can't support Corbyn, you know, because, you know, he'll be too disruptive. And then we had, you know, Brexit and the pandemic, which Boris Johnson completely mishandled, and, you know, a totally chaotic Liz Truss government, etc. So I'm sort of trying a bit to say there are risks that come with having a left-wing government because they would change things and there'll be opposition. But there's risks with centrism and there's risks with the right as well.
And I think that's really important, and that sort of bravery to step away from a centre and make a case. I think what happened when Labour lost its heartlands up north, that could be a question of, were Labour brave enough to push back a narrative that was being pushed through media, through right-wing media around, you know, the reason you haven't got a job is because of immigrants, or actually the reason you haven't got a job is because industry has been decimated in these regions over decades. But we weren't maybe loud enough or brave enough to say what you're being told is wrong, and this is why, because there's a fear of, oh, maybe if I stand above the parapet, I'll lose out too, and it becomes sort of a question of bravery versus you know, longevity.
Yeah, but then if you don't make that case, like when the riots happened in the summer, this summer, you know, Starmer didn't stand up and make that speech that said immigration brings problems, but it brings benefits, and you know, people who are scared of it live in places where there are no immigrants, and let's get real about what immigration really is. And because he didn't make that speech, which would have been seen as a risk, we're still left with a kind of poisonous conversation about it. So sometimes what's seen as the safe option, you know, on climate, you know, that the idea that we might very gradually change our economy because of the climate crisis, which sounds okay to a lot of businesses, that's a huge risk, isn't it? And so I think particularly in the world we're in now, and I think that's one of the reasons why Corbyn touched a nerve, a lot of people, especially perhaps younger people, realise that sort of small, cautious policies are not enough now. You know, when I was first doing political journalism in the 90s, when Blair was Labour leader, you know, at that time, you know, Britain had a lot of problems, but there was less poverty than there is now. The climate crisis was like a distant thing. So a Labour leader who was kind of charismatic but quite cautious like Blair, I didn't really like him, but I could kind of see, okay, this will do, you know, and I think a lot of people felt that, and that's why he won enormous victories, you know, the first two. But we're not in that world anymore. We're in a world that is much more turbulent and threatened. And so that sort of like centrist version of what Labour could be, I would argue, is just not right for the times. And we saw that, didn't we, in the election in July, that Labour did fantastically well in terms of winning seats, but their vote was pretty small. Because it was almost like what they were offering was too modest, I would say, for what the country has as its problems.
And the right was saying something that sounded more instant in terms of we can fix it more instantly. And I think it will be a problem for Starmer, won't it, now that he's in power, that, you know, he will, I'm sure he will do some things that are good, but there'll be sort of slow progress in certain areas, and the next election, Farage or whoever will stand up and say, I'll sort this out immediately, and that will be quite attractive to some people. So in terms of Right Ideas, obviously we're in East London, it's a London festival, so I do want to talk about the GLC and Ken Livingstone and his legacy. So I was telling Andy in the green room, my dad was a parkie in Victoria Park in the 80s, and when the GLC got disbanded, you know, funding parks was cut, he ended up losing his job. So we had a very strong connection to what was happening in like East London at that time. And I think Ken Livingstone's a really interesting character. I was probably too young at the time to understand him as a politician. By the time I sort of became aware, he was a bit more of as I was saying, a bit more of a caricature, a bit more of a TV personality. And it was really interesting in the book, sort of learning to, sort of understanding his role in London and governance of London. and the legacy that that's had now that we have the Greater London Authority,
Yeah.
and Sadiq Khan as mayor, because Ken was able to push back against some narratives around you and create, I hate to say bubble because it's so often used in a negative way, but created a bubble in London where he would stand and say, London is a nuclear-free zone, when actually, Thatcher's just up the road, Ministry of Defence up the road, and very pro-nuclear. And that's quite interesting that he could push back on those strong in a really strong way and get Londoners on board. And I think we see a bit of that now with Sadiq Khan, like after Brexit. So, well, London is still European and still open to, still open, still welcome. He supported Black Lives Matter movement, much more open to LGBTQ activity. And I think that's quite an interesting thing around what Ken did in terms of the governance of London.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, forgive me, people that know this already, but London, in the 70s and the 80s, is in lots of ways a declining city. The population was going down, a lot of dereliction. It was also often quite a conservative city. There were a lot of Tory MPs. And one of the things the GLC did was, under Ken Livingstone, they said, we don't want London to carry on declining. We want there to be more people in London. We want public transport to be cheaper, to run later. We want a kind of expansive vision of the city. And also it's going to be a multicultural city. And that stuff's all standard now, but it wasn't then. And I think for a lot of people that was quite exciting. That Livingstone was a clever politician. He realised there were some people on the left who would just vote for him as the lefty. But there are all kinds of other people who just wanted a cheeky person to be the face of the city, who would revive the city. And he would do clever things. So they gave lots of grants to minority groups, which was incredibly controversial at the time. And he knew that, but he would also do things like, which obviously your dad benefited from, he reinstituted having like floral borders in parks, because he was like, older Londoners who like Victorian parks are going to like this. And so if they've got cheap buses and the parks are back to their Victorian splendour, they will maybe just slightly tune out the gay rights stuff they're a bit nervous about. And it was that combination of sort of reviving the city, but keeping an eye on a really broad electorate. I need some old white guy who's 80 to vote for me, and I need, the middle class person who's wealthy, and I need the person who's 20 who's in a council flat. I need the whole coalition. And that was a sort of very clever politics. And although I've said the book is not just about elections, I'm interested in how you maximize your power. So Livingstone particularly, Livingstone can be a bully. Livingstone is a tricky customer, but he was very, very clever about power. And one thing he did at the GLC, which always makes me laugh, is a lot of the GLC councillors, when he was running the GLC, were still Tories. He only had a small majority. And Livingstone was a big sort of reader. And he'd read all this stuff about ancient Rome and how the power was manipulated then. And one of the people who was, maybe Caesar, I can't remember, used to schedule votes for Friday afternoons, because essentially the rich conservative foes of his would be at their country estates outside Rome, so they wouldn't be there to vote. And Livingstone scheduled lots of votes on Friday afternoons because the Tories would be at their second homes and they would not be there. So just those sort of clever, it's almost like sometimes sometimes you can win power, but then you've got to kind of get in there and think, how do I absolutely maximize it? Livingstone never had a big majority, but he managed to get a lot of people on the right of the Labour Party to vote and work with him. Whereas, tragically, I would say Corbyn, although in some ways, a kind of better human being than Ken Livingstone, wasn't able to build bridges with the other parts of the party, but also they did not want to build bridges with him. And so his leadership was much more beleaguered. So it's kind of, I'm interested in when the left gets these opportunities, which don't come along that often, how do you maximize them? Because when they come, you've got to really seize it, I think.
Do you think he paved the way for the way Sadiq has been able to keep London sort of separate from national politics to a degree?
Yeah. I mean, the Mayor of London, as people here will know, has a lot less power. The powers of the local government in London have shrunk. The GLC had a lot more power. But yeah, I think the idea of London as being in some ways separate, I think, London is too dominant, and there's too much kind of power and wealth here. But the idea that London is somewhere where you can feel safer if you're a minority, where maybe things can be tested out and then maybe they'll happen in other cities, I think that's quite positive. And although Sadiq Khan is not particularly radical, I've really liked the way that he sort of stood up to Trump and as he stood up for gay rights. And, he's very good with different religions and sort of standing up for Jewish Londoners or Muslim Londoners. I think So I'm sure Sadiq would, if you spoke to him, would say, "Oh, Ken Livingstone, oh no, too dangerous." But I think actually there's been some real influence there
to sort of be able to be that sort of have a rebelliousness.
Yeah. And Britain is the country it is. Maybe it would be better if every region of Britain had a powerful government of its own. I would like that, not just Scotland and Wales, but all the regions. But it doesn't. And so if London Mayor has a bit of power, let's use it.
And Andy Burnham has been able to do some similar things in Manchester too, having that.
Exactly. No, that's absolutely right. And it's interesting that whenever you talk about the GLC in a more sort of like official context, you always get people coming up to you afterwards who like saying, "Oh yeah, I work in the city government in Seoul or in Rome or whatever, and we want to know about city governments all around the world. We're interested in how they, if you like, turn the city around to some extent."
One of my favourite bits, and it's only a little comment in the book, but when the GLC was disbanded and the first thing Ken and the GLC officers, he was like, "Right, let's get everything out." So things like photocopiers were being given to community groups, and just like, right, we're going to make sure that we don't leave a trace. Everything that we can do, we're going to do to make sure that someone benefits before she closes the door on us.
Yeah, they were kind of posting checks and things to like local organisations, till 1 minute to midnight, just getting it all out. So there's a kind of cheekiness, which is, it's fun to read about. But also, again, I like that because it's being streetwise. It's like something that John McDonnell did before John McDonnell was an MP. He was a GLC councillor under Ken Livingstone, and he ran the money for Ken Livingstone. So he was like the kind of Chancellor of London. And John McDonnell was very young then. He was like 29. And he looked through all the local government legislation, which the Tories had written, and it had all these clauses in it that said, a local council can get a bit of extra money for unspecified purposes. And he was like, we'll get that. So he got all this money in, basically through loopholes in the Tories' own legislation, and used that money to give it to, gay groups and anti-nuclear groups, and the Tories were furious. But again, it was a way to think, this is the hand we've been dealt. We're running the GLC. It's got these sources of funding that the Tories don't know about yet. We will use them for radical purposes. And one of the reasons why the GLC was abolished by the Conservatives was because they were scared. And there's a great quote from Norman Tebbit, where Norman Tebbit said, before abolition, essentially, I'm paraphrasing slightly, they're creating a new socialism in London, and that's why it must be abolished, because it's like, this isn't some old-fashioned thing. There's a new thing going on, and we need to shut it down.
Do you think there's some correlation there as well? Because you talk about like the Preston model quite a bit, and I did in sort of Preston, there's a very different way of doing local government. It's much more local. It's very independent, and it's a very good model. It's been very successful, but hasn't been adopted.
Yeah.
Do you think that's more of the same? It's that this isn't the established way to do things. We're not gonna celebrate something that is successful because it's just it's too scary, and if it happens across the rest of the country, the establishment will be doomed.
Yeah, I don't know if people here know Preston, but Preston in Lancashire, it used to be quite a rundown, quite troubled small city. And Matthew Brown, who's the council leader there, who's a quite radical, who was a admirer of Benn when he was a kid, has basically produced this way of doing things where the council realised we've still got quite a lot of power. So if we're going to get someone to do all the catering for the council, we're only going to give it to a company that has a diversity policy, or we will only give the sandwich contract to like a local baker who pays, double the minimum wage. So they're using the council's procurement every single time to reward employers that are good employers. And it's not like Preston is a perfect place, but if you go there now, it's quite a buzzing kind of place. The city centre is really nice. And interestingly, because I went to see Matthew Brown to interview him, and I said to him, are Starmer's people coming to see you? Because Matthew Brown's very popular in Preston. They get re-elected every time there's council elections. And they won't, they're sort of like, oh, you're too radical. Yeah. Even though a lot of people in Preston are not particularly left-wing, but they're like, this is a good council. It's improving the city. So some of those people, they're slightly kept on the fringes because they're not operating in the way that a lot of Labour councils are operating.
And that leads me on to the topic of frustration.
Yeah.
Because if you read the book, if like me, I went on a journey of like feeling hopeful, then frustrated, then hopeful again, and then just like, we seem to just go round in the same battles within the left and the right of the Labour Party particularly, where we get so far and we start to get a bit radical and we start to see things that could be really hopeful, and we all go, and then the establishment comes in and takes us down again, and it's like forever in perpetuity, it feels. And I guess it's just, and that sabotage, demonisation, and ridicule as well. If you just talking a little bit about that, and why do you think we haven't been able to break that cycle? Is it as simple as, that fear from the establishment? Why we never quite get over the line?
Yeah, I mean, people on the left make mistakes as well, clearly, don't they? I personally was a Remainer, but I think the position that Labour ended up with in 2019, where it's sort of the worst of all worlds, kind of Remain but only just kind of thing, that was probably just a mistake that Corbyn and some of his colleagues made. I think that's the case. There's big headwinds from kind of powerful institutions. I think that is also... people just get worn out. These people I've written about, they manage to stay the course, but lots of people are very radical for 10 years of their lives, and then, Oscar Wilde quote, socialism takes too many evenings, that kicks in for people, so people fall away. But yeah, the frustrations are real. When I'm feeling more optimistic, which is not always, I think that if you look at the British Social Attitudes Survey, which is a really interesting piece of work that's done every year about people's underlying attitudes to, wealth and inequality and so on, the country in its underlying attitudes is in quite a left-of-centre phase at the moment. It won't last forever, but people are much more left-of-centre about, even Tory voters, if you ask them, do bosses have too much power over workers, a majority will say yes. So at least potentially, and especially I think amongst people under sort of 40, there's a lot more for the left to work with. When I was sort of becoming political in the early 90s, at that point, the number of people who were genuine on the left in Britain was maybe 10 or 15%, whereas now it might be 25%. So there's more to work with. Yeah. And it's a question of accessing those people and giving them something to vote for. But it is frustrating, and some of the time I was writing the book was after Corbyn's leadership had ended. And so, in my day job, it was like writing a column about, Corbyn's, the latest purge of Corbynistas. And then I was going back to my book, writing about Corbyn's defeat in 19 whatever. And I was like, this is not making me happy. But yeah, I do feel that there's more to work with now. And I think there is a recognition that the problems of the country and the world are bigger. So more radical politics is an easier sell. Whereas in the 90s, it was quite hard to say to people, we need big change, because the system wasn't working for everyone, but it was working for maybe 2/3 of people, and so it was harder. Yeah. But yeah, there is immense frustration, and sometimes the mistakes are self-inflicted. It's not all about the other side. Yeah. People make mistakes. All the people I write about have made big mistakes. So although the book is sympathetic, and I think they're all in some ways quite heroic people, they've also done awful things and made huge blunders, and they're flawed. But that's because they're real, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I know there's going to be lots of questions, so I've got one more before we open the floor, and just sort of going on to that. And the book ends almost, I guess in some ways it's a bit of a cliffhanger, because the election hasn't happened yet. Diane Abbott was still suspended. Yeah. No one knew what was going to happen with Jeremy Corbyn. If you were going to write another final chapter or another epilogue, what would you be? Where are your thoughts now?
I think the book came out in May, so I finished kind of tinkering with it in sort of February, sort of very last tinkering, copy editor getting very angry, sort of adding teeny bits here and there. But basically since then, we've had the whole thing about Diane Abbott, them trying to stop her standing, then her managing to stand. Obviously, we've had Corbyn winning as an independent. We've had John McDonnell being one of very few Labour MPs to increase his majority. And Labour's performance in the election as a whole, fantastic, in terms of seats. But a lot of voters on the left did not vote Labour, they went elsewhere. So I guess, I've actually written a sort of postscript for the paperback of the book, essentially chewing over some of that, saying that maybe in May you might have said, okay, these people might have been heroic, but the story's kind of finished. One or two people who reviewed the book who were of a slightly more centrist persuasion, shall we say, kind of reviewed the book saying, this book's all very well, but these people, this is all history, who cares now? And I think it's harder to make that argument now, because some of the people in the book here, they're still there in Parliament. And also, I think, there are other, Zara Sultana, these sort of people come up in the Labour Party. Some of the most talented young Labour MPs are on the left. Now, whether they'll stay in the party is another question. But I think that I'm a bit more optimistic now than I would have been in the spring. When I thought, Diane Abbott's my MP, and I remember thinking in the spring, she's not going to be allowed to stand. They will just find a way to stop her. And so even if she steps down in a year or two, the fact that she defied them and won that battle was very important, I think. So I think the sort of postscript that I've written is a bit more optimistic, and maybe a teeny bit told you so, but only a teeny bit.
Thank you so much.
Keir Starmer's going to walk in and just shut the event down now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for answering those questions. It is such a fascinating topic. I could carry on asking questions, but I want to bring everyone else in. So I'm going to give Alex the microphone. And
Sorry, is that it? Yep.
Yeah.
You haven't spoken much about John McDonnell. He got a mention for the GLC Chancellor, and I just wondered, what's his relevance now? What's going on? I like the guy. So
I mean, I think in some ways, it changes, but sometimes I think he's the person in the book that interests me most in a way, because I think he's remained relevant, because John McDonnell's very interested in the world. So if you go to some little, the 4-day week and why we should all do it, John McDonnell will be in the corner, like taking notes. He's not there to say, here I am, I'm John McDonnell. He's interested. He's perpetually curious. He's from a working class background in Liverpool, where he's a mature student, so he's sort of autodidact. And I think, he's been very effective since the end of the Corbyn leadership. He's always in the media because he's a good communicator. And I think he's able to make quite radical arguments in quite a common sense kind of way, which is interesting, because when he was younger, he was charismatic, but he was quite an angry young man. He was a militant briefly. And then in the Commons, when he was first an MP, a lot of people didn't like him because they thought he was aggressive. And I think, he's got older, he's mellowed, but he's very good at making alliances. And I spoke to someone who'd been involved in some campaigning against the expansion of Heathrow. And John McDonnell's constituency is right by Heathrow, so a lot of his constituents work there. And John McDonnell's a huge opponent of Heathrow expansion. And this person said to me that John McDonnell is very comfortable building coalitions with people on a single issue that he doesn't agree with on anything else, because he's confident of where his politics are. And I think Corbyn, although in some ways an easier person to have a chat with than John, was never as good a politician as John McDonnell at kind of building bridges. And even when the Corbyn thing was beginning to fall apart, McDonnell was the person who was behind the scenes reaching out to Labour centrists, saying, you need to stay on board, we need to get together to defeat Johnson, etc., etc. Now, that didn't all work, but I liked that, if you like, him saying, I'm a radical and I've got my politics, but I will make alliances when I need to. So I'm sorry I haven't talked about him much, but he's a really important person in the book. And also just his identity as, he's a northerner. The book's quite London-based, because a lot of radicalism in Britain in the last 30, 40 years has been in London. But although McDonnell's constituency is in London, the fact he's from Liverpool is very central to who he is. So he brings something slightly different than the others.
That's my fault for questions, I think.
Hi. Do you think there's going to be a new left-wing party anytime soon?
It's something I've written about in the Guardian. I think it's highly possible. Yeah, I do. There's always people talking about a new left-wing party. But it feels like there's more of a groundswell now. A lot of the people who are involved are people who are quite young, who were involved in Corbynism, and they've now shifted away. I think if you have a Labour Party, as Starmer has, which is so intolerant of dissent, if it says, if you rebel in the Commons, we're going to suspend you, you're kind of inviting people to go and set up another party. And of the MPs who are currently suspended, John McDonnell being one of them, lots of people have said to me, they may never go back, because either they won't be allowed to, or they'll just think, what's the point? Where Blair was Labour leader, he did lots of things that I didn't like, but you could, McDonnell and Corbyn and Diane Abbott were rebelling virtually every week, and they were never suspended. And people sometimes went to Blair and said, you should suspend them. And Blair said, I'm not going to, because Labour needs to have a broader church. So I wouldn't be surprised if a new left-wing party did emerge. And also the first past the post system, everyone always says, makes it impossible for small parties, and it makes things much harder. But now that all the parties are very unpopular, it's beginning to break down. Independents won in the election, whereas independents don't normally win in general elections. So it's possible that a new left-wing party that got 7 or 8% of the vote might actually get some seats, because Labour support is lower, it's more fragmented. So yeah, I think it's quite possible that it will happen. And and Starmer is in a way creating an environment where it's more likely, I would argue, by being so intolerant. But I'm uneasy about it. I mean, I'm on the left, but I haven't always voted Labour, but I generally do. And I voted for Blair, even though I didn't like him because I wanted to get the Tories out. So I'm uneasy about splits on the left, but Labour has to be able to say to people on the left, you're allowed to rebel sometimes. If you're not doing that, if you're a party with a big majority, to basically suspend people for rebelling, I think is, too far, I would say.
Following on from that, the question I was going to ask, what do you think will be the catalyst for a change in the next, say, 4 years? I mean, in the past, it's been social decline, unemployment, and that's led to huge changes in government. What do you think will bring about a socialist revolution?
I mean, I suppose if the status quo is working for quite a lot of people, that creates some kind of stability, doesn't it? And we're in a situation now where the status quo in the economy is probably working pretty well for about 15% of the population at most. Even pretty privileged middle-class people can't buy homes now, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's one thing that it's not an overnight thing, but the status quo is increasingly inadequate. I also think it's quite possible the next election, Labour will get a really quite small vote, but the Conservatives will as well. So you might get a very strange kind of election result. You may get more left-wing independents standing, so people may think, look, here's an opportunity. The left are not so excluded. I think all those things can all happen. There has to be a kind of belief in the system as well, and I think that's really kind of faded. So, my politics are not revolutionary, but my politics are that, really big change is required. Purely the climate crisis requires that. So I think there could also be very big economic shocks. We've already, this country, I mean, I don't need to say this, but, it's a very fragile country now in terms of people's health, people's level of wealth and so on. So there have been times in the past, like when the financial crisis happened in the early noughties, that was a huge shock. But that was a country where there was far lower poverty, where the NHS and services like that were better funded. So it was a shock in a country that could absorb some of that shock. A similar kind of economic shock now, I think, would be much more explosive because a lot of people are not really coping now, let alone, if Trump as president in the US imposes huge tariffs and there's no growth in the economy here, which is quite possible, I think there's just a lot more fragility. I'm not really answering the question in a very kind of direct way, but it feels like belief in the status quo is weaker and that the material conditions of people's lives are much more fragile, the great majority. My kids, they're middle-class white Londoners, but they're quite radical, and it's basically they've been radicalized by they've been through austerity in their schools, and then they think, what work are they going to get, et cetera, et cetera. And there's people who are far less secure than they are. So, and sure, populism can draw people in who are dissatisfied, but I think populism's quite thin. Farage is kind of good communicator and all the rest of it, but, I think even as an MP, people are already seeing you're never there, so I think that's something that maybe will only draw people away for so long. So I'm not predicting an imminent revolution, but if you were going to have one, you would see these kind of conditions would be what you'd see, in advance of it.
Did you want to speak? Yep.
Okay. There's quite a lot in your book, actually, and you don't know where to start, really. I mean, for 30 years, basically. And the question you asked about in your article about a new party forming on the left, you've answered, really. But I was just wondering, basically, that Labour has been pretty unlucky in a couple of times. Only for a half a point. In the Healy-Benn election for the Labour Party, things would have turned out differently. And again, if Grenfell had happened a week earlier than it did, Corbyn would have been Prime Minister, not Theresa May, But I had just finished reading a book by, when your book came out, Labour's Civil Wars by Giles Radici and Patrick Diamond, who lectures up the road here. And I was just wondering whether Labour is just basically genetically in its genes is doomed to split every time it basically gets near getting over the rainbow, which you referred, you know. And I'm just wondering if the Rachel Reeves actually had in her present budget, if the same thing had happened to Sir Liz Truss actually, would she have lasted as long as Liz Truss actually? Because, you know, it's, you know, it may happen slightly longer, but you mean, sir, it's unfolding as we speak, you know. And you mean, just to finish off, actually, Will Hutton also actually wrote a book just as yours was coming out, and the title of his book actually was called No Mistakes This Time. And I think we can think, you know, it's been nothing practically but nothing mistakes. So if you want to look in your crystal ball and tell us what you see, you know.
I mean, I think the first point you make, that Labour often splits, you know, when the kind of prize is in sight, I think that is a real problem. I mean, I think that we saw this when Corbyn was leader. That I think Corbyn was in some ways quite a flawed leader, but he was being undermined, as we know, constantly by people in his own party, even though initially he tried to get them to join the shadow cabinet and so on. And it's often a problem that when the left are powerful in the party, the right of the party, you know, throw their toys out of the pram and, you know, often go and form another party. So that's a problem. I think something that, you know, before we get too gloomy, I've actually spent a lot of previous books writing about the right as well as the left, even though I'm absolutely not on the right. We mustn't overestimate the strength of the right. You know, they have the institutions, they have this economic power, but the Conservative Party's electoral record since the 80s, since 87, they've only won one good majority in a parliamentary election. Labour have won 4. So the Tories have their own problems, and I think sometimes people on the left need to be a bit more confident. I think Labour has huge problems and obstacles, but the Tories are a much more unpopular party now than they were in the 80s and previously, and that's a big change. They're out of touch with the values of a lot of people and so on. But there are these excruciating moments where Labour gets very close, like you're saying in 2017. Even when Grenfell had happened after the election, when Corbyn went and showed real emotional intelligence with people who'd been bereaved, and Theresa May didn't really know what to do, I remember just, you know, people said, didn't they, he looks more prime ministerial, you know. So that was, and you've alluded to this, you know, Benn came very close to becoming deputy leader of the Labour Party and lost by kind of 0.5%, and because of, you know, 1 or 2 unions didn't support him who said they were going to. So there are these excruciating moments. But looking forward, I mean, you know, I'm always cautious about making predictions. Before the election we've just had, I was going to write a column saying I bet Starmer gets fewer votes than Corbyn got in 2019, and I didn't have the balls to do it, and I wish I had, because obviously he did get fewer votes. He got about 700,000 fewer. Yeah, exactly. But it feels like the politics we have isn't really that sustainable. You know, this current Labour government will do some good things, but it's not very popular. The Tories are, you know, very unpopular, very extreme. You know, the only dynamism really is in the kind of Green Party, and that's a relatively small party. So it feels like something's got to give. So I'll be kind of surprised if at the next election we revert to a kind of stable, you know, big majority kind of situation for anyone. I think politics, you know, I think one thing I've thought about quite a lot in books I've written before is how people are living and how politics is. There is a relationship. There's often a time lag. Politics is quite slow to catch up with how people are living. But like, you know, Britain in the 70s became a bit more materialistic, and in the 80s we got Thatcherism. You know, there is a connection. So if we're in a kind of struggling society where people's views are more left of centre than they used to be, I think that will be reflected in politics. But it's how long the time lag is, I guess, is the question.
We've got time for just one more, and you've had your hand up very diligently.
Hi. Now, I agree that Corbyn and McDonnell made a load of mistakes in the 2019 election. But to me, it always seemed like the massive problem is the mass media, the mainstream media, and how they portray anyone on the left. So Starmer's accepted. I mean, and it's the BBC, the Guardian, everything, the way they report Gaza, Israel, you know, Brexit, the platform that they gave to Farage. Yeah, the platform that they gave to Farage, you know, I mean, I'm not saying he should have been no platform, but, you know, that really sort of boosted his popularity. So how do we deal with the mainstream media, including what used to be, you know, towards the left, like The Guardian?
Yeah. I think it's a really good question. I think it's really, really difficult. I think that because the mainstream media as a sort of bogeyman for the left are so familiar, you can kind of think, oh, we've heard that before, but it's so important. All the people I've written about, a huge amount of damage was done to all of them by this kind of relentless assault on, you know, their character, their histories, etc. And it's really difficult. And I think the BBC, I think there's a real problem with the BBC now, that the BBC is never going to be obviously a radical broadcaster, but the BBC treated Corbyn as a kind of extremist, whereas it treated Boris Johnson as a kind of fairly mainstream conservative. Whereas anyone looking at those two politicians would have said they're both radicals. You know, Corbyn a bit more hardworking, we could say, than Johnson, but you know, they're. So I think it's a massive problem. And you know, I've worked at The Guardian for a long time, and you know, I'll defend The Guardian, but The Guardian's a coalition, and I would argue that the parts of the Guardian coalition that are more centrist, I think on issues like Gaza and Corbyn's leadership have had too much voice, you know, and Guardian readers are probably quite evenly divided about that stuff. And yet, when the anti-Semitism crisis happened under Corbyn's leadership, the Guardian's reporting of that was 90% basically, it's a huge problem and Corbyn's got it all wrong. And the 10% of coverage that was, you know, saying something different was not prominent. It's really difficult. I mean, I think sometimes digital media can help, you know, something like Novara, you know, I don't love everything they do, but I think it's a really good website. There are sources of information that, you know, didn't exist 20, 30 years ago to get around that. But I don't really have an answer because Britain has a very, very conservative media compared to most democracies, and that drags our politics to the right, and there's just no way around that. And another function of that media, which is really important, is it prevents people being informed about the state of their society. So when there's an argument about tax in an election, lots of people have no idea, you know, quite how wealthy people are who are paying the top rate of tax, for example, or how much poverty there is. So the Daily Mail or whatever, it obfuscates, you know, when there's an argument about immigration. You know, lots of readers of Tory papers think immigrants are much more numerous than they are. You know, they have all these kind of distorted. So it's not just the propaganda function, it's the fact that a lot of people are not well informed, and it's really, really depressing. And I think it's worse now than it has been. You know, the BBC at times in its history, like in the 70s and the 80s, was much more challenging and would broadcast stuff that the Thatcher government hated. Whereas now it feels like they're quite craven. You know, still some brilliant things on the BBC, don't get me wrong, but it feels like the overall politics, you know, the way Trump is presented on the BBC, essentially is as a kind of someone within mainstream bounds. You know, Trump is a fascist. You know, that's just, you know, I studied fascism at university, it's quite clear he's a fascist. And yet the BBC, you know, presents him as just a kind of rather colourful right-wing politician. And that's tremendously helpful if you're on the far right. And Farage, as you mentioned, has been on TV, I think, on Question Time more than any other guest since, you know, the 90s. I found out a really interesting thing, a final point, that Oswald Mosley, who was obviously a British fascist in the sort of middle of the 20th century, he was effectively banned from the BBC for about 40 years. And in his autobiography, which I had to read for kind of research purposes, he's absolutely furious about this. So the BBC in a past era said, Mosley, you're too extreme, you're a bigot, you're not coming on. And they kept that up for 40 years. So it can be done. But yeah, it's dark times, you know, in the media. And as I say, The Guardian does some fantastic stuff. But even in The Guardian, there's a kind of cautiousness about radicalism and about a final point, you know, about Gaza. The Guardian always says Israelis killed first, then Palestinians killed. That's always the formulation in everything The Guardian writes. And, you know, personally, I find that shameful. You know, a huge number of people have been killed on both sides, but a lot more Palestinians. And yet it's always framed around October the 7th as the only, and that's The Guardian, which is doing a reasonably good job of trying to be, you know, fair, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a real problem because there's never going to be a big radical left media, but you kind of need the centrist media to do a better job, and the centrist media let alone the right-wing media, I would say, are not doing that.